everyone, welcome to Ask a Political Scientist. I am so glad that you are here. It is another Thursday here in whatever the heck 2020 is, and we really intended to do like 5 of these shows, but we're all still inside, and political science is still awesome, so we are continuing to do this show. I am so happy that you are here. I am your host, Andrea Jones-Rooy. I am a political scientist and a stand-up comedian, and in this show, we answer the call of humanity and finally bring political science and comedy together at last. I'm going to do a quick introduction and then I'll bring on our guests and we will hop right in. I've also tossed out a question to the chat. So if you are involved in YouTube chatting rather than just watching, but just watching is okay, feel free to shout out how you're doing and I'll review those after the intro. So this is a show about political science. For those of you who have not been to this show before and or do not already know what political science is, political science is a 2-step process. Step 1, use scientific methods to understand politics. Step 2, then be totally ignored by policymakers, voters, and everybody else, including my own family, with a special asterisk, except my family who's been watching this show. You all are now basically, you have PhDs in political science. I think if you've seen at least 15 of these, which I think I have a second PhD in political science, which is what we all need. Today is July 16th. Another reason I do these shows is to keep track of what day it is. It is July 16th. And we are here to talk about immigration and citizenship in tough times. And we're going to be a little bit more formal about what we mean by tough times. But one hint is, like now. In particular, during tonight's show, we are going to cover 3 major topics that all weave together. And our expert guest is going to help see how they weave together. So, as advertised, we're going to talk about immigration, and we're going to talk about citizenship, and we're going to talk about, within tough times, a very tough time related to COVID-19. So I'm going to now introduce our very first guest. We have 2 guests. We have 1 political scientist and 1 person representing the views of all non-political scientists ever in the world. Our political scientist for this week, we are so excited that she is here. We have Sarah Wallace Goodman. You can follow her on Twitter at @SarahGoodman, which is every week the Twitter handles get better and better. She is a professor of political science, an associate professor of political science at UC Irvine. She earned her PhD at Georgetown University, and I normally don't go back as far as undergrad, but I am today because we have a number of audience members from Ohio, so we're shouting out Miami University of Ohio. Please join me, all of you tuning in, to welcome Sarah to the show. Sarah, how are you today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. I am thrilled to have you here. Where are you, if you're comfortable sharing, joining us from today?
My home office in Irvine.
Your home office in Irvine, yes.
Where I've been for 132 days. This sounds like a hostage situation, but
yes.
We're all in it, so.
I was about to say, who's keeping you there? And then I was like, oh, the government.
Our government, yeah,
a virus and everything else. Are you staying healthy, sane?
Yeah.
Where are you doing okay?
Well, I have 2 small kids, so sanity is a dimmer switch, as our governor would call it. Sometimes it's brighter than others, but we're doing okay.
Okay.
We're forging through. We're lucky that everyone's healthy.
Excellent. Well, I'm very glad to hear that, and I'm very glad that you have found the time to join us within all of this. I am going to do for you now what I do for all of my guests, which is a somewhat creepy review of my internet stalking of you and all of your accomplishments. For those of you who are watching at home or somewhere else, though I'd be fascinated to know where else you are, and you don't already know about Sarah's work, this will be a quick recap. Sarah, are you comfortable with a This Is Your Life / academic work review?
Yeah, let's do it.
Hell yes. All right. So, I kicked you out. Stand by. There it is. All right. So, Sarah is the author of Immigration and Membership Politics in Western Europe. We will be talking more about that very soon. She is also the author, and Sarah, tell me what you think of this book cover. She's the author of a forthcoming book called Citizenship in Hard Times. What do you think of my cover art? Do you think that's
Well, I would spell my name differently, but otherwise.
That's the second time I've messed that up. That's even more embarrassing because my mother's name is Sarah, and she also spells it with no H, so I've shamed my entire family. Other than that, what do you think of the cover?
I mean, it basically conveys the message, right?
Perfect.
Yeah. So
I was like, maybe another color background, but this is where we are. All right. So you just finished this manuscript last week?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's hard to believe because you work on these things for so long. Then by the time you finished, you're kind of, it's like you're in a real love-hate relationship with it. And right now we're not on speaking terms, but I'm sure I'll circle back to the manuscript and just do some final edits before I send it off to the editor.
I'm mostly impressed that by anyone who does anything during 2020. So that's insane. I appreciate
I started it a while ago.
Okay.
I started it before 2020. So.
Got it. Very good. All right. Well, we will be talking a lot, hopefully, if you can stomach it, about your findings in that book. Sarah has also written all kinds of other papers. I have just pulled out a few that touch on some of the themes we'll be talking about around immigration, integration requirements for integration's sake. So she's done a lot of work to categorize and compare and identify civic integration policies in different countries. We're going to unpack all of that very soon. A work on naturalization policies in Europe, inclusion and exclusion. She's done a lot of really cool work about how immigration is controlled through language and requirements around country knowledge. In fact, your book hits at that quite a bit. And another paper that I thought was really interesting is national belonging and public support for multiculturalism. You can follow Sarah on Twitter and find her website and get to all of these papers. I recommend reading them. But I want to also, before we go on and introduce our second guest, just flag for everyone. So you've finished a book. I appreciate that you didn't start it, but still, finishing a book is a monumental thing. Sarah has had, to me, an insanely productive 2020. And again, I know that this work takes longer than the year that it comes out. But here are papers that Sarah has written just in 2020. So Migration, A Step Too Far for the Contemporary Global Order. Good American Citizens. I'm especially excited about this one. A Text as Data Analysis of Citizenship Manuals. More to come on that in our discussion. And Local Government Efficiency and Anti-Immigrant Violence. It's killing me to not just ask you to explain all of these right now, but I promise we will get to it. And the one thing I do want to dive in on right now while we have visuals up is an ongoing project that you are doing with two co-authors, Shana Kushner-Gadarian, who's been on the show before, and Tom Popinski, on partisanship, health behavior, and policy attitudes in the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, and a follow-up paper that has come out on partisan endorsement experiments affecting mass opinion on COVID-19. So I was texting with my family right before this show and saying one of the many cool things that you're doing is real-time research, like research on political science as things are unfolding. And to me, that's not all that common in political science. Can you share a little bit about what this ongoing project is all about?
I mean, maybe that's right, but especially in the early days of, stay-at-home orders, I just felt so frustrated. Like these things were happening, and like, what skills do I have? What can I do? I can't just sit at home, and like I deal with anxiety by working, and so.
Good for you. I deal with anxiety by not working, but
and eating, but like also working. So yeah, I need to make that clear. So like Shana and Tom are, friends of mine, and we chat on Twitter, and I'm like, hey guys, like we all study different kinds of crises. Like here's a crisis, like let's talk about what we expect to find. And so we actually got together really early to work on it. I was traveling in Europe at the end of February and like looking at Italy and like, what's going on? This is definitely going to come to our country. Why aren't we talking about it? And then it did. And so we were actually like really early in like getting a survey into the field and getting some funding for it. And so we started to look, the first survey was back, mid-March, and we saw like all these crazy partisan patterns that we completely expected to find because partisanship as early as February and not discussing COVID publicly and not mobilizing the CDC in a public messaging campaign really sort of established itself as an explanation of like different behavioral differences and attitudes, and it continued over time.
Great. So, well, not great. Sorry, horrible.
Terrible.
But great that you've documented it because a lot of us are relying on. Well, it seems pretty partisan, and I'm hearing stuff in the news that sounds pretty chilling. But it's so, to me, at least, this is one of the things that I love about political science and try to impart on the show is we can sit down and actually find out just how much, for example, different people who follow different party guidelines or different party leaders behave. And we can really document that. So we have some graphics here that show some of your results. I just want to flag first that this research has rightly been picked up by a number of media outlets. So Vox has covered this research quite a bit. The New York Times quoted you. You and your co-authors wrote a story that I thought was really compelling in The Hill called "We Need the GOP to Flatten the Curve." And Precisely one of the quotes that stood out to me from the New York Times review of your research was exactly what you just said. Partisanship is a more consistent predictor of behaviors, attitudes, and preferences than anything else that you are measuring. So you mentioned your first round of studies. So I'm going to get rid of our faces for a second because this is an important graphic. It might be a little bit hard to see. Are you able to talk us through what's going on in this image?
Is this image taken from the first wave?
Indeed.
Okay, so here we're looking at back in March. We're predicting behavior based on your partisanship. So here, Democrats. So if you look at the first row, right, who's more likely to report that they're washing their hands more? Democrats are statistically significant, more likely to report that they're washing their hands more than Republicans.
And so Republicans are this red line, right?
Correct.
And Democrats are the dots. Cool.
Right. And so you're sort of looking at where the line and the dot doesn't cross the vertical line, right?
Yep.
Right. So Democrats are more likely to report buying hand sanitizer, more likely to report avoid contact with others, avoid gatherings, sought information on COVID, self-quarantining, and then just the sum of all the behaviors. And so here we're seeing almost across every behavioral item that we ask that there's this partisan difference between what Democrats are doing and what Republicans are doing. And what's really interesting that we can do in our data is that it's a real conservative estimate. We're able to control for all these other factors like demographics and rate of infection in your county and the partisanship of the governor of your state. We're able to take all those into account as well as individual level controls. So this is for every individual. It's a very conservative estimate, and like partisanship just pushes through.
And it's quite striking to me, especially as you were describing it. You're controlling for who your governor is. You're controlling for how bad the outbreak is. And this was back in March when there are still big differences in terms of where the outbreak is worse. But for sure. And you do the same thing with attitudes. We won't walk through the exact thing, but it's just insanely striking to me here, right? We say Democrats are way more likely to say that, we should increase spending, for example. There aren't enough tests. So you mentioned you weren't surprised. Was any of this surprising, or was it just like, okay, we have documentation of what we all thought was going on?
It was kind of documentation of what we thought was going on. Yeah. And we also added, we had a bunch of attitudes about policy. So that was actually one of the initial drives from my perspective, because I study immigration. I was like, okay, we're seeing all this really xenophobic rhetoric about how we talk about what did we call it back then? We called it the coronavirus, but also called, the sort of the racialized terminology. And so I was like, well, how do people feel about banning immigration from Italy, where it's high, versus China, where it's already peaked, right? And so we have a bunch of questions about policy positions as well, but nothing, I guess, was very surprising in that respect in terms of how we expect partisanship to play out in terms of shaping attitudes. Well,
we did. So you mentioned this was from March, and you've done a number of waves since. I'm going to zoom in on one of these in a moment, but this represents now 3 waves of the study. And so the overall trends here, what jumps out to you in terms of, so these are health behaviors by party, right? So blue is Democrats, red is Republicans. Again, what are the big trends? What are the big takeaways here?
So what we're seeing here is that the partisan divergence continues over time. So if you remember back to a month called April, there was like a week in there that everyone's like, well, we're all converging now. We're wearing masks. The stores are closed. We're all in this together, right? And so there was this belief that, well, like Republicans and Democrats are converging as COVID-19 was moving from the coasts and into some of the red states, right? And so
is that around when we thought we'd be back in churches by Easter? Is that
around that time?
Okay, great. I remember that time now.
That's right. When we were sort of ready to open up about 6 weeks after it started. And so in asking these different waves, and I should say that this is panel data, so we're asking the same individuals over at 3 different time periods here, like how much you're washing your hands, or are you seeking information on COVID-19, right? And so we see that not only do partisan differences not get smaller, so we're not seeing convergence, but we're seeing divergence on some items as well. So if you look here, you see that avoiding contact with others, avoid gatherings, you see the differences are getting larger between partisanship, right? And that's extremely worrying, but it also kind of comports to or reflects how, what we're seeing around us.
Absolutely. And the one thing that stood out to me as well is washed hands more often. We have all flatlined. Like Democrats are doing it more, but no one is increasing.
Are you touching your face?
But right before the show, I did a whole self-face.
Yeah,
I like to do that. Yeah, I have a different channel where I do ASMR hand touching. Okay.
Yeah.
The last one I want to zoom in on, and then we're going to bring on our next guest, and then we'll dive into our broader conversation, is you and I are both professors at universities, and so this is on my mind. You have kids, so this is probably on your mind as well. This final graph, how worried are you that schools are closed? It looks like we're Democrats, independents, still more worried.
Yes, and I mean, I'm at a 5.
Yeah.
So like, I don't know. Like for me, that confidence band would be what? It's like I would take myself out of here. I'm such an outlier. I'm at like a 6. It's just a lot. Yeah, but I mean, so again, this was like early to mid June. So this is already. I mean, if you think about where you were a month ago, mindset wise, about.
I was gonna say I was right here, but mindset wise.
Yeah, I mean, you're all exactly right here. But in terms of like your optimism about opening up the economy. I mean, that's when Disneyland said, we're going to open July 17th, right?
Right.
So like we were all kind of in a really different mental position. If we fielded the survey today, I suspect that this looks really just different, right?
Yeah.
So our 4th wave is supposed to go out August 1st.
Okay.
And so I suspect we'll see maybe a little U-turn in some of these attitudes by then.
All right, I'm going to have to start having you come in every time you do one of these waves to unpack it for us. And basically just something like, yeah, I told you so. That's what I feel when I look at these. All right, so
I love saying that. I mean, I won't miss an opportunity.
Yeah. Empirically, I have now. Well, you have told all of us. So, all right, so folks, so that is a very quick overview of the breadth and depth of Sarah's work. Sarah, and I'm just going to flag the number of times I got your name spelled right on this slide. So we're going to remember this. We're going to listen to our memory instead. Sarah, we have another guest joining us tonight to join the conversation. Are you ready to welcome our comedian guest for the show?
Yes.
Hell yes. So our comedian guest, we have Keith Price. He is, brace yourselves, he is a comedian, an actor, a podcaster, a radio talk show host, and producer, and frankly more, but it wouldn't fit on the slide, so I started with that. You can follow him on Twitter, speaking of amazing Twitter handles, at Comedy Daddy, and you can follow his podcast at KP Curtain Call. More on that in a moment. You have heard him on Sirius XM. In fact, he was the first out African-American radio host on Sirius XM, which is fucking awesome. He performs here in New York City at all over the place. Some of my favorite venues that he performs at, the Duplex, the Stonewall Inn, Broadway Comedy Club, and he and I met on the radio on the Dean Obeidallah show, where he is a regular guest as well. Please join me, everyone at home, and join me, Sarah, in welcoming to the show Keith Price. Welcome, Keith.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm fabulous.
Excellent. I wish I could claim fabulous, but I feel like I would be lying to you, but I'm very excited that you're here. And I'm also just now putting it together. You have a lot of purple in both your headshot photo and your vest. So well done.
Just a little bit.
Just a little bit. Excellent. And where are you quarantining or riding this out?
I'm quarantining here in New York City.
Very good. So we're neighbors. How is the quarantine treating you?
You know what? It is very challenging in that I still cannot believe that I have been in an apartment with someone for the last, I don't know how many months.
I've lost track.
And we've
only mentioned April, but I forgot that month.
Yeah,
so I don't know.
But just the last week, we finally had one of those, moments. Like just if you could give me 2 seconds, like we're there. But I feel like that's pretty good considering.
I'm so amazed you made it that long.
That is because the best part is that what am I going to do? I mean, I can't let myself get mad. It's like I have a place to hang out for the remote foreseeable future. I'm still getting unemployment, knock on wood.
Good.
So
that makes you are now officially the only person I know who's getting that. And I know a lot of people who have been trying to get unemployment. So what's done there?
You know what? Yeah. And the best part is that I was very lucky in terms of the timing, because one of the many various gigs you wind up doing, I was working as a tour guide last year up until August of this year. And the whole company dissolved, and it was like my one opportunity to get on unemployment again. And so I did. And then I had like a bunch of weird things happen in between. So I was off again, on again, off again. And then the week before everything went down was the week that I got everything squared away. And then it was like, oh, thank God.
Wow. Yeah. A week later and you'd still be on hold like everyone else. Wow.
I mean, okay. So I was very, very, very lucky. So
Wow.
Are you telling me that $1,200 isn't like carrying you through that?
This is the policy analysis we're looking for. Yes.
You're not still living off of that
In
windfall?
New York City? Yeah.
Yeah.
I just can't believe that, they've able to say it and be okay with it. Like, yeah, we gave them $1,200 and they should be happy. Like,
Yeah. What more do you
In
want?
March.
like that's like months ago.
Which I'm told is a different month than the one we're in, right?
I think we should just dissolve it into one misery month. I don't know what to call it yet, but hellscape comes to mind. So anyway,
The 130th day of March. I've
Yes.
just continued, yeah.
Yes,
Wow.
indeed. It's just going to be March until it's 2021, at which point it might still be March, depending on the vaccine. All right, so I want to dive into our conversation, but first I do want to introduce Keith to our viewers at home. Keith, are you ready for a little roundup of?
I'm all about it, darling.
Here we go. So Keith does many things. One of them, I stalked you so hard on the internet. One of them is he is a guest critic on New York One on Stage. What is New York One on Stage for folks who don't?
It is the weekend theater roundup show that happens on New York One here in New York. And this was perfect because I got asked during one of their diversity moments to come on and talk about it. So I was like, oh yeah, I'll be a guest critic. How you doing?
Yeah.
So it's like, I got a lot of opinions about this show. So there you have the moment. And it was interesting because, there aren't a lot of people of color who talk about theater, much less, critique it. And so I was very honored to be a part of that mix. And I'm always looking for them to call me back again, but you know how that goes.
I do know how that goes.
You have no shortage of opinions that you'd like to share. Yeah.
If you want to drop theater opinions as we go, I won't stop you, Sarah. You let me know.
Nor I.
Perfect.
I'm here for that.
Yeah.
All right.
Switch between immigration and citizenship and theater reviews. All right, so that's
my dream.
Perfect.
That's my dream. Yeah.
We're writing a new show right now. Perfect. You are also the host and producer of an awesome podcast, Keith Price's Curtain Call, which you all can find more about at keithpricecurtaincall.com, and you can listen to it all over the place, including Broadway World, which is a great supporter of the show. Thanks, Broadway World. Google Play Music, iTunes, and beyond. What's going on Keith Price's Curtain Call?
Well, we have been on a bit of a hiatus.
I believe that.
Because it's been very difficult trying to navigate myself through this process. And, to do a podcast and to bring it up to date now with all this Zoom in and carry on, it's like a whole different commitment now that I have to make. And right now I am still trying to figure out what in the hell am I going to do? Feels like because the bitch need to make some money. Let's be for real. Like, it's like that podcast shit is cute. Don't get me wrong. And I love talking to the people that work in theater, and I love the theater, and I love all of that. But right now, even within the arts, it's trying to support yourself in the arts right now is a hard sell, and it's so terrible to be like, hey, let me see if I can sit down with one of these big famous Broadway people for nothing.
Yeah.
I don't pay you, you don't pay me. It's great.
Yes. You are speaking on behalf of all artists right now. You
exactly.
are 100%. Yes.
Yes. So, but
you do have a Patreon, right? So folks could be a what's the word on NPR, like a returning member, a pledging member. I don't know the word.
Fabulous. That would be wonderful. Yeah. Patreon.com/KeithPrice.com.
Yes.
That's Keith Price's Curtain Call. There we go.
Yes, and if you donate enough, you get producer credit. So everyone, hop right on.
Yes.
All right. All right. So you also have written a number of one-man shows. Your first one, which folks can watch on Amazon Prime right now, is Ebony Chunky Love, Bitch Can't Get a Date, featuring my favorite picture ever. What's going on in this show? What can people expect? Why should they tune in?
Oh my God. Okay. So this is actually a documentary about me that was done by a wonderful friend of mine who's a professor in Seattle, Washington.
Right.
And it was based on the one-man show that I had sent him and a couple of friends to watch. And they sat down and did this whole psychological breakdown about what it must mean and sociological perspectives of my comedy and how it influenced.
Wow.
And I was just like, I didn't even realize I was that deep. Like, this is cool.
Wow.
And so what my friend did was he put together this documentary where we do clips of me doing comedy, as well as having conversations about race and gender identity and stuff like that. And it was really great. I mean, it is an award-winning film. We did win the San Diego Black Film Festival's Gay
Hell yeah.
Lesbian Best Film. Thank you very much.
I thought I knew you from somewhere. Very good. Yeah.
And then we got to travel around and do a lot of the film festivals, which was a lot of fun. And we
Awesome.
also were on Logo in the early days of Logo. We were one of the feature documentaries. So it was a very exciting time.
It's exciting. Very good. Well, my father watches the show a lot, and he's a documentary filmmaker, so he should watch it especially, but I will watch it, and we should all watch it. So check that out. And hopefully when we can all leave the house again, you can continue your comedy touring and all of that. And in the meantime, you all can follow him on YouTube as well. You have channels both for Keith Price's Curtain Call and Comedy Daddy. And I just put up a bunch of other pictures I stole from your website because it struck me that you just have so many pictures of you like embracing awesome people. And I just forgot that we could all be close together. And so it really is nice to just look at his website and see people being together, in addition to them being amazing people. So
wow. I'm looking at what you've done and I'm like, wow, I'm really kind of fun, huh?
Yeah, very fun. All right, show's over. We're just here to show empirically that Keith Price is fun. So there's obviously a lot more to Keith Price, but please follow him at Comedy Daddy and KP Curtain Call to keep up with the goings on. But let's dive into the things we are here to talk about. The last thing I want to say is we are every week for this show, in lieu of charging tickets, which we would do in a real life in-person show, we invite you to donate to help raise money for what we deem to be a good cause. And so you can donate to paypal.me/askaps. And this week, all donations are going to Fair Fight, which is the organization led by Stacey Abrams to help us advocate for free and fair elections. So if you've been following the news, and even if you haven't, you are aware that we need some help in that category. So please send your donations. The PayPal link is also in the video description, so you can donate there as well. All right, so oh my goodness, let us dive in. We are talking immigration, we are talking citizenship, and we are talking COVID-19. Let's get rid of these images and get into it. What about that? All right, so Sarah, you have been studying immigration. I would say it seems like most of your work is about immigration, with the citizenship book perhaps being a new chapter. What is it that you're interested in your multitude of papers and your book about immigration?
Well, so overall, I would say that I'd describe my research interest as looking at who gets to be a citizen, what that means, how society defines it, and what you do with it. So I'm really interested in kind of the whole story of citizenship, from the beginning, who gets to be it, to the end, what you do with it.
And how do you find out what the rules are for someone to be a citizen? Because you study a bunch of countries, so Western Europe and the US, right? Are you reading documents? Are you
you become myopically nerdy about things in graduate school, and then you just stick with it for forever.
Failed. This is why I'm not,
Or you then become like someone's source, and they will call you, Sarah, I had a question about citizenship in Belarus. And you're like, I'm nerdy enough that I know the answer to this extremely narrow question of yours.
And asking on behalf of all Americans, how do we become citizens in Belarus?
Yeah.
Is it too late?
Spoiler alert, you can't. Right. I have yet to find the pub quiz, though, that is exclusively citizenship questions. Like, one day I will stumble into that pub and just like own that.
You need to run that pub quiz is what you need to do.
Yeah, right.
Or at least a Sporkle quiz.
That's right.
Yeah.
So like, there are a lot of people that study citizenship policies, citizenship rules. I worked on a project when I was a postdoc over in Maastricht with a friend of mine, Martin Vink. He heads up this big project where we read all these citizenship laws and we consult with a bunch of lawyers, and so we interpret what this language means into like comparable measures, so that we can say, well, it's easier to get citizenship in France than it is in Switzerland, because we have these kind of measures to compare things like language requirements and residency requirements and filing fees and sort of all the requirements up and down the line.
And you came up with there's a term for this metric, and it's very cool and futuristic sounding.
Well, so like I did one for the cultural requirements, the language and the country knowledge and the oaths, right? Those are civics. Yeah. So like my first book and my dissertation and like the first kind of chunk of research I did was this sort of a practice of cultural requirements for citizenship was like a really new thing in Europe in kind of the early 2000s. And it's just so old hat in the United States. The ceremony, the citizenship test, it's like so a part of like the myth of becoming a citizen, and it's really important. And maybe you guys have been to a naturalization ceremony, or maybe you've seen one, but like they're very emotional, they're very exciting, and I've been to a few, and in LA they hold them at the old Coliseum, and so you can buy popcorn and sit in the bleachers and just like really go. It's like quite a show. And so like, but these were new practices in Europe, and they were looking at the United States and learning from how we do it. And so this was like an exciting time for me, right, in grad school to be like, look at this stuff that's happening in Europe. And like, I wanted to see how states were doing it, and to compare how they were doing it, and try to explain why some states were doing it like this and other states like that.
So where is it first in Europe, where is it easiest and hardest to become a citizen? And then where do those fall relative to how easy or hard it is to become a citizen in the US?
So it's like definitely easier in the US compared to any European country still. So we still have them. There's lots of ways to compare requirements, you know, but like if we're going to look at real brass tacks, like we just have more naturalizations, right? So like if you looked more narrowly at things like the citizenship test, for example, like, so again, I talked about the myth that we've built up around it, but like at the end of the day, it's a 10-question test, right? And you can just download the 100 potential questions that it's going to be and study those questions, right? And it's like a discrete set of questions, right? It's not going to be a new surprise question.
Right.
But in European practices, like those questions are not available, right? You can buy study guides, right? You can buy flashcards and things like that, but like you don't know at the end of the day, like the full test bank of questions. And there's more questions, right? So in Germany, there's, you know, upwards of 50 with plus some from the state. So
and these are all about like culture and history.
Exactly. Values, right. And so, you know, even if you looked at just that small example, like the US is easier. Of course, some states don't have tests, right? So there's variation, right? But look at residency requirements. The US is still on the low end compared to, you know, Germany, which is 8. Switzerland can be 20, like they can decide that you need to stay longer, that you haven't demonstrated sufficient integration. And so like across this sort of big spectrum of policies and practices, I think the US is still
it's the easiest.
Wins out. It's weird to say in 2020, but I maintain that view.
Conversations around immigration in the US these days are how typically it's very, very hard for everyone to get in, and getting harder, right?
So that's immigration, right? I mean, but you know, once people have permanent residence, actually you still see big gaps between people that have permanent residence and people that apply for citizenship. Like a lot of people you might know waited 20, 30 years and maybe just applied for citizenship last year because there's actually, unless you really cared about voting or serving on a jury, right, there weren't a lot of differences between permanent residence and citizenship.
So Keith, if you don't mind my asking, so you are a first-generation American, is that right?
Yes, that is true. Both of my parents were from Honduras.
Is what Sarah's describing squaring with your experience?
Well, I mean, not having to have dealt with that. My parents immigrated to the United States my mother came in 1959, because that's, I mean, don't get me wrong. I know I feel young and I'm moisturized. But my mother was 1959 and my father was in 1960. And so when they immigrated to the States, you have to remember what politically was kind of happening. We were coming out of Eisenhower and going into Kennedy. And so there was this very strange, wonderful affinity that immigrants and Black people, especially, and Black immigrants that come from other countries, had for JFK. And so my parents kind of came in at the time of that wave. And so then eventually they went through the process of becoming naturalized. But I think both of my parents were already naturalized by the time I was born. So they did this in the 60s when there was a whole other different kind of parameter of how to do that. You know, there was also a lot of really great chain migration kind of things happening too, because, you know, like my grandmother was one of the first to come here, and then she brought my uncles. And then, so like it was that kind of way that we were able to immigrate to this country as a family. But being first generation American Black, being born in the 60s, I kind of got screwed because my parents didn't teach me Spanish as a child. We learned, the Spanish that I do use when I can use it is Spanish that I had to learn like through school. And the reason is because when my parents moved here, being Black was the only identity that they wanted us to have to deal with. Because again, strange enough, America really couldn't wrap their minds around Black people that also speak Spanish.
I think many Americans still can't, but I'll leave that aside.
But I mean, to see it now, it's not unusual to me because it's always been that way. And then growing up in Texas, hello.
I'm dazzled that you're here and cheerful. Yes,
exactly. Like we're talking like the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and that was a very odd time for people of color. Like when I tell people that my high school that I graduated from was not integrated until 1971. And one of my dearest friends from Facebook in high school, we were just chatting about it, and we were saying that we were very lucky because she's white, that we grew up at a time where integration was already a part of the process. So that by the time we integrated in middle schools and all that other stuff, none of that stuff was unusual to us. So by the time we graduated in the mid 80s, we were like, we don't find it weird that there's a Black person or a Latino person. We were all in honors programs. And so like, it wasn't a weird look for us. So getting outside of that, out of Galveston was kind of like, oh,
interesting.
People aren't that bright everywhere else. Isn't that weird? Go figure.
I'm going to use that as an excerpt on the promo for the show. That's a lot of fun. So that brings me to a concept. Sarah, I want to ask you one more thing about your immigration work, and then I want to jump to your new book because they are related. You use the term civic integration, and you've also written quite a bit about multiculturalism, which builds right on the themes that Keith was raising. So what does it mean to have civic integration, and how do you measure? What do you mean by multiculturalism? Are you measuring it? What does that look like?
I measure everything. Like political scientist.
That's also going in the promo reel for this.
If I can't measure it, it's not going in. Yeah. So it's interesting. The idea of civic integration, and I won't bore you with like the Dutch origins of it or anything like that. Sorry to any Dutch viewers.
Well, right? I am half Dutch and my family is Dutch, so thanks a lot. You're off the show. We'll talk offline about the Dutch origins of civic integration. That's
right. But the idea is that you can integrate, so like be able to move about society and like a citizen, right? That it's citizen-like, that and that you could do it as an individual. And what's really interesting about these civic integration policies is that they were explicitly introduced in the early 2000s up through that whole decade, is that they were explicitly introduced because the idea was multiculturalism had failed. So multiculturalism was this philosophy, it was an idea, but it was also a set of policies that existed in places like the Netherlands. We understand it a lot in the United States as well. Canada is a big practitioner of multiculturalism as a policy. The idea is that you can integrate not by teaching individuals how to sort of be, autonomous and move about society themselves, but that by recognizing groups and accommodating them as groups, that they can become integrated. So when we talk about multicultural policy, we're talking about policies that accommodate immigrant groups or national minorities or indigenous people, right? So like exemptions from dress codes, right? That you can wear, like in your driver's license, that you can wear sort of a religious garb, or having bilingual education funding, things like that. So the idea of multiculturalism was that you could integrate as part of your group, right? So you could provide halal meat at a public school cafeteria. And the idea of civic integration was like, well, we've been doing this and it's not working because maybe you're integrating, but you're still integrating as part of a group. So it was referred to in Britain as parallel lives, that you were integrating, but you weren't interconnecting. You weren't
with
part
like
of a sort of
other people in that country.
Correct, right? So we were encouraging you to integrate, but you weren't making these connections outside of your ethnic or religious or social group.
What was the motivation for that? Like, why is it bad if groups are not hanging out with, the majority citizens? Is it just racism? That's what I'm getting at.
So like the former race chief in Britain referred to it as sleepwalking into segregation, that it was leading to these differences being perpetuated structurally, right, that prohibited individuals from these multicultural groups from sort of achieving, different social goals, right, or changing economic status or other social status because they were sort of stuck in their separate but parallel lives.
So
that was sort of,
So are you saying, so like when we were kids and we would have to have like the international potluck food day where every person brought a item of food representing their culture, that was the way that we were trying to get people to understand that everyone's different from the kids' perspective, right?
Right. I mean, we celebrate differences, and this is where it gets a little tricky, right? Because you can have a multicultural policy where like the state might provide funding to do that event versus a multicultural philosophy where you recognize and celebrate differences, right? So the US is kind of a mixed model. The alternative to multiculturalism before civic integration came about was assimilation, that we just mute those differences, right? And so the alternative to assimilation was multiculturalism, but then we saw, well, multiculturalism also has these problems too, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, because again, assimilation is the technique that many of us African Americans, certainly of a certain age, like that was how we were able to navigate getting through a chunk of the racist shit that was thrown at us. And that is because, we have learned that we need to have a customer service voice. We learned that we had to have a better command of the English language, especially when we're being challenged by people. Because the one thing that intimidates people is when you actually can communicate better than they can, while they're just flailing and using their 7 words that they've been given their whole lives. And so it is a way for us to manage to move through the process. The fucked up thing about it, and I'm sorry to use that language like that, is that it also works against us, because again, it's not that we're doing it to be ourselves. We're doing it so that the rest of these idiots that are in the room don't feel intimidated by the mere presence that there's a person of color in the room. And that's just the reality of it. It's like, that's what's happening. That's what we're seeing. And it's like, I get so annoyed because it seems very simple. It's like we're all, how much more stress and strife do we have to keep having in this world to figure out that we really are all in this together? This pandemic virus does not care about my big black gay behind. It does not, you know what I'm saying? It does not care about, you, Ms. Goodman and Dr. Goodman and your fabulosity and your research, because if it catches you and it catches you on a day where you're not strong enough to fight it, it doesn't matter. And to me, that says that's that signal, if you're going to be all weird and bizarre about it, that's the signal that tells us that, you know what, we really are all the same, and we really need to stop all this stupidness, because look at it, it's going to kill us. It literally is going to kill us. So, I don't know how to reach that 30% that people that feel like everything that we're seeing is a hoax, and that, they deserve to have their statues and they deserve to have the flags, and I don't know what to do with those people. I just don't.
I don't either.
You don't have data that shows us that we should do X, Y, and Z.
We have data that shows what doesn't work.
Right.
Which in political science, we're like, we don't publish null results. That's like a thing that like, it's less exciting. Journals don't want to publish it for lots of reasons. But like, it's an important lesson that like, if you change who delivers the message by partisanship, or you even change the message in relation to like the CDC, which is one of the most trusted institutions, right? It makes no difference. Makes no difference on people's behavior. Yeah, not anymore.
Yeah. So I want to jump to your citizenship work. So not that we've like resolved this, because to me, and tell me if I've got this right so far. So we have this massive, well, really a tension, and quite a problematic one, right? Where we say the government says, or the majority voice says in whatever country, we want to integrate, which is we want you to be among us, the majority citizens or multi-generational citizens or whatever. And that means behave like us, and okay, every now and again you can keep your own cultural quirks as well, but like
You can
A,
wear
the
your
fact that
dread.
someone is drawing that line seems problematic, and B,
Right.
and
There's
exactly
also a second interesting tension in there that you just touched upon, is that the state requires you to be independent. So the state is like really assuming this paternalistic role here and telling you, the individual, go be an individual. Right? There is an inherent contradiction there too, which I always find a little amusing.
right. And again,
Go be an individual, but be just like us. That's what the message is. That's what it is.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's
and
right.
by us we mean the demographics of the most of the people in power in the government.
Yeah,
So
that's right.
So
It's all
let's
politics.
jump to your recently completed manuscript.
Yeah.
Again.
I love the sound of that.
It's fantastic.
It makes me feel so unaccomplished right now, but thank you.
100. Thank you for saying that. Like literally, when I emailed you, Sarah, to do the show, you were like, "Yeah, maybe not this week because I'll be finishing my manuscript, but the following week." And I was just like, the fact that truly that anyone does anything is a monumental achievement for me. So, citizenship in hard times.
In hard times,
Hard times comes at the end. We're all in hard times. What do you mean in this case? What are you looking for what about citizenship are you examining here?
So I'm looking at what civic obligations are, what we think good citizens do, right? So if I asked you, what does it mean to be a good citizen? You might say a good citizen votes, a good citizen serves on a jury, a good citizen looks out for people less fortunate than they are, right? So we can think of all these different things, what it means to be a good citizen. And what the book studies is how these definitions are affected by democratic threat. So the hard times that I'm looking at are democratic crises, things like electoral interference, things like political polarization. What do citizens do when confronted with these real democratic problems? So we know what elites do, right? And there's a huge literature and a fantastic book by Levitsky and Ziblatt, How Democracies Die, and they tell us what elites are supposed to do, right? They're supposed to be party gatekeepers. They're supposed to guard the guardrails, right? But like citizens are the other half of this story, and we just don't know. We don't have systematic evidence about what they think they're supposed to be doing, what the role of the citizen is in hard times, right? Because the consequences are really important. Like if some citizens think, well, my job is to be obedient and do what our leader tells us to do, that's very different than the citizen that's like, well, I'm going to protest every single day, right? And so I wanted to, we have these different images, right? So on the one hand, we have these huge protests, right? And like, okay, people are really stepping up, and like, you think about the Women's March or the March for Climate Change, right? You have these, but on the other hand, you also have Charlottesville, right? And you also have sort of these ideological silos, as we call them, on the internet, right? Where you only sort of retweet the people with similar ideas than you. So like,
I don't know what that's like, but yeah.
What's Twitter?
Yeah.
It must be a hobby for people with free time. Right, some people. So I just wanted to know, and because I'm a comparativist, which means I study, systems across countries, I thought, well, this is a general question about democracy, and so I look at 3 advanced democracies. I look at the U.S., the U.K., and Germany. So different institutional systems in place, but I want to say, well, what do citizens do in hard times?
And so why hard times? I mean, do we know what citizens think they ought to do in regular times? And is it more or less what you just described? We all agree we should vote, we should do this, we should do that. Like, is it fairly stable across regular times?
Fairly, yeah. So by and large, we have some other surveys from previous years that show us that, citizens generally think that they should vote, they should obey the law, they should, there's lots of different items on civic engagement, join associations or civic duty, right?
Volunteer or whatever, yeah.
Exactly, right? So those are sort of general attributes that people highly rate over time.
Okay.
But what makes hard times different, I argue in my book, is that these definitions become partisan. So Republicans think that being a good citizen is something very different than Democrats.
And is this true? It's partisan in all 3 of the countries that you study? This isn't just a U.S. thing?
So it's partisan in all 3 countries. It's most partisan in what we call majoritarian systems. So the UK and the US. So a country like Germany is a consensus-based system. So institutions are designed for power sharing. You need, more than one party in a governing coalition. And so in those systems, there's there are more opportunities to win over time. And so less zero-sum games. And so there's less partisanship in not just how individuals view civic obligation, but in how they respond to democratic threat.
So from like an ideological perspective here, just like speaking about this country specifically, it is for someone like me who stands and just looks. All I can see is that on the one hand, the Republicans, at least the ones that are currently in power now, are doing everything to restrict the rights and freedoms of everybody else. Not because they feel that whatever it is that they're doing, they shouldn't be doing. It's just, it feels as if it's an idea that they should be in control of everybody else's thing. Whereas when I look at the Democrats are like basically, well, they're kind of being a little bit wussy now, but like, I feel like they are not, we don't spend our time and energy trying to stop people from living their lives. And I think that that's the fundamental difference, that, you can deal with partisan issues, on the fine points of finance and on the fine points of international trade. But when it comes to people's actual living existences, it seems that there's a lot more invested with the Republicans to control and stop people, i.e. abortions, i.e., police brutality and reporting it and dealing with it. Like, it always feels as if there's, gay rights. It always feels as if they're trying to keep people from having a normal existence. And so it is very easy to see, that's the way we see it because that's all we have. And it makes the third party challenges even weirder because you're like, I kind of sort of think you're right too. But like right now, there's not enough pull in one direction and we're so caught up in that thing. And so I wonder, when you're doing these kinds of assessments, how do you take into consideration that there is that kind of, I would say, malevolence underneath one side?
Right.
I mean, it's malevolent energy.
Right. Well, so I have to ask the questions like in a neutral way, right? But
you don't begin every survey question with "How fucked is this?" blah blah blah. Okay.
No, I start with "How fucked are you?"
Yeah.
No, but I mean, we see these kinds of patterns, like. So some of the attitudes that you're describing, they correlate or they align with authoritarian personality. And there's a lot of social science research that shows that that these attitudes have really sorted along partisan lines. So Republican Party supporters and are highly correlated with people that hold authoritarian personality traits. And this is something that I also find here because what we see is that there's no incentive for system winners or incumbents to do anything about threat, right? And that's a real problem when we think about how we solve threat, right? So there's no incentive to respond or punish Russia in response to an electoral interference because you benefit from the status quo. There's no incentive in dealing with polarization because you benefit from the status quo. And so what we see is a real asymmetry in how citizens respond, not just in terms of like personality traits, but in terms of what they're going to do. So when we look at all the behavior or when we look at all the responses to threat, it's almost exclusively coming from the partisan left. In the UK and in the US, it's the partisan left that really expresses pride in institutions or vigilance, right? Being watching the government or embracing liberal norms, like understanding other people's opinions or having friends with other people's opinions, and because they have something to gain from challenging the system. So there is it's partisan how they interpret civic obligation, but there are also system incentives that prohibit some sides from responding. That when those connect, when they align, is a real problem for democratic stability and really like presents a challenge for thinking about, well, how do we respond to this threat? How do we diffuse this threat, right, to prevent like a democratic erosion?
Right. I want to turn for a moment to our audience. Speaking of democratic erosion, We have. I asked early on in the
Where's this going?
the chat has started its own
Speaking of democratic erosion, here's Seb Gorka with a question.
I just begin all my sentences with speaking with democratic erosion, comma, more coffee. People are watching, are sharing how they're feeling. I asked at the beginning of the show on the chat how you're doing, and we have my mother in Maryland who's in perpetual flight or fight mode. We have Christian watching from Ireland, who's a former student of yours, Professor Goodman.
So nice. Hi.
We have Ito watching from Indiana, who says he could be worse, could be better. So I don't want to make assumptions about people's political leanings, but it sounds like these are fight or flight, could be worse, could be better, not enthusiastic. So maybe this is my segue to democratic threat. Maybe nervous about the various threats to our democracy. Chime in the chat if I'm overstating how you're feeling, right? But I'm nervous. I am nervous about the future of democracy. I'm nervous about all the things that you described. I'm nervous about fair and free elections, et cetera, right? And I mean, how far back does your book go? Is this something that the left has been doing characterizes the left for a long time? Or is this something that's a reaction to, at least in the UK and the US, populist leaders in the last handful of years, right? Is that what is coming out in this pattern? Like, are we all just freaking out on the left because we're not winning? Or is this something the left cares about?
So my book is only a snapshot. I did surveys in 2019. We have some, other surveys that show us like civic attitudes over time, and we don't see the same partisan pattern on the left or the right. So both sides have responded to sort of democratic hard times. I've had conversations with colleagues who are skeptical of the characterization that we live in democratic hard times because the nature of democracy is contestation and conflict, right? And the test of a consolidated or a real strong democracy is its resilience, and that we'll elect someone new and we can revive the norms, right, that eroded. But I think even if you're skeptical of the characterization that we live in democratic hard times, you should want to know what citizens are doing, right? You should want to know how they respond, and that they respond differently based on partisanship, because it tells us that citizens interpret their obligation as a citizen, right, which is ostensibly like this national identity that unites us, through partisan interests, through gains and losses for their party. They respond as a capital D Democrat and not a lowercase d Democrat, interested in preserving the institutions. And so it's hard to rebuild norms. It's hard to just elect someone new and replace them. It's hard to suddenly decide that the Hatch Act now matters, and for people to have faith in, right? If someone interfered in our last presidential election and we did nothing about it, how confident are you that the next election is going to be free, fair, right?
I've been saying that since the election, the last election.
Right.
I've been saying, because if you notice, there has been no legislation passed to deal with any of this. There's been no conversations on anybody's floors about how to deal with this. And I think that ultimately, in the end, like you said, it's like whoever benefits the most from this is going to spend the more energy trying to make sure that things stay the way they are. Right. And that's why when you see Mitch McConnell, that's why when you see Miss Lindsey Graham, when you see all of these people that are preserving some sort of ideology that their way of life is better than everyone else's. But what I've noticed is, as a person of color, we've always been mad. Let's just be for real. Yeah. We've been mad. Yeah. And what I'm finding fascinating now is that a lot of people are catching up with the anger.
Completely.
It's like, because let's face it, that a lot of the great white people that I like to call the good white folks, you good white folks, what has happened is that you can still always fall back from having to be present and still benefit from everything.
Right.
If you fall back. But what is happening now is that you're not allowed to fall back either. And you're noticing that when you don't fall back, it's really kind of shitty out here.
Yeah.
And now that you see
there's a vigilance that's required.
You're all of a sudden now there is a resurgence amongst this new energy, I should say, amongst people that are looking now to see that Black lives matter, that Black trans lives matter, that, all lives matter. But you're smart enough to recognize that right now there is a crisis that we need to deal with as a whole. And if we can fix that crisis or work on that crisis, then it will make the conversation about everybody's lives matter make more sense. But if we're not going to take care of whoever's in need or whoever's in trouble, like we've got 50 million people basically unemployed. You know, hello. And it's like, you know, there's people now that are literally on the edge. They're on the edge. And they're not just Black folks. It ain't just Latinx folks, honey. It's some good old-fashioned fabulous white people now that are feeling the burn. And they're feeling the burn now and realizing that they can't retreat back to, well, I mean, like, it's okay. I mean, it's not us that's feeling it. It's like, no, we are all feeling it. And what we're seeing now is it's more about the disenfranchised versus those who think that they have all the rights. And they're going to be in control of them. And that's the tug of war. Because the thing is, like this woman, she was brilliant. I saw during the riots in Minneapolis when she said, it's a good thing that Black people just want equality and not revenge.
I saw that clip.
Right.
And not revenge. And it's like, and what's happening now is that I think that other white people now are not only, you know, like I said, I've seen the pictures of the poor man in Albany that got knocked over by the police and they knocked him down and his head was bleeding and they walked past him and the guy still, like, you're now seeing Pawpaw getting knocked over too. Your grandfathers are being harassed now. Your grandmothers are being pushed out of the way by these police officers. You know, it's something that now you're seeing that can actually happen to you without any provocation.
Right.
What's her name? Shayna Taub. Do you guys know Shayna Taub, the fabulous composer, lyricist?
No.
She's going to be working on the musical The Devil Wears Prada.
Oh, cool. Great.
So just to throw it out there with Elton John, because But just recently, they were during the early parts of the curfew, she was sitting on her front stoop at her building, and the police literally chased them inside their building on the streets. And of course, it was a big to-do. It's a big news moment, but it was like, because they can do it to you too. And now that you're seeing that, I think that that's what's fueling a lot of this new energy to want to do something, because you know what? This is messed up that people are having to live like this. And now it's happening to us too. So I'm glad that, you know, people are catching up and walking up to the line now. But now we all have to, now that we're here, we need to start moving forward and like do this for all of us once and for all. Like we have to keep coming back to this stupidness, because this is stupid. The way that we're living, it's ridiculous that we have to live trapped inside of our apartments because America wanted a racist to be the president. Or the Russian asset figured out a way to have, you know, his friends get him in. That's what we're living with now. And part of it is because nobody wanted to show up. It's like, this is what's happening now. So now you're realizing, or people are realizing, it's all of us up in this mother scratcher. We all got to do something.
So are all these ideas that Keith is describing, it's absolutely resonates with my experiences and what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing for sure, which is, you know, again, it's the folks on the left or identify as Democrats or maybe just anti-Trump or whatever group that we're thinking about on these partisan lines, Sarah, that you're describing. I mean, where are we getting these ideas? Is it we're all individually coming to these conclusions as we're observing all the things that Keith is describing? Or is it more of an elite cues story, by which I mean the people we look up to? I'm try to be a nonpartisan show, but let's just be honest, right? The people that we are looking to who are telling us to do certain things are on our party side, and so we're getting those messages from the top down. Or is it both? Like, where do these ideas, how do they change, and where are they coming from?
Yeah, I mean, it's both. Like, a lot of polarizations, you know, top down, right? You know, so parties consolidate around certain ideologies and messages and issues, and, you know, voters sort, right, according to, you know, how that consolidation happens. But like the thing with citizenship is, right, it's bottom up, right? So citizens are sort of taking their personality or economic circumstances or sort of these other factors that exist in their life, right, and sort of interpret what their role should be in society. And the fact that partisanship, and so this is like a theme, it's also kind of why I was really sort of aware of it and thinking about COVID, right, is that, you know, that partisanship can override, right, and define someone's civic obligations, right, has really kind of worrying consequences about repairing these schisms between people, right, where you along whichever social identity, right, that you may find most salient, it's this idea that like partisanship really locks us in, and have very motivated reasons to stay that way.
I almost imagine now, going back to our earlier conversation, like coming to the U.S., you have to take a different immigration or a citizenship test depending on which party you plan on joining, right? I mean, who's even deciding what the switch are? So I want to make a little bit of time. We're running short on time, and I apologize for that. For audience questions, so we have a question from Ito. Going back to the citizenship question, is there a correlation between how easy it is to obtain citizenship and whether a country leans more towards multiculturalism or integration?
So they are connected, yeah. So the number one driver about all these policy settings is politics, right? Who's in power, what the political constraints are, and so we typically see these multicultural policies in what are traditionally really inclusive citizenship contexts, right? So we can sort of think of them as really open towards inclusion along both of those dimensions. And so like a place like, I hate to call them out every time, but like Germany or Denmark or Switzerland, right?
Is that Germany? Yeah.
These are harder countries to get citizenship in, and they also never had like explicit or formal multicultural policies, right? Mm-hmm. So it's easy to sort of say that these are very homogenous societies. And so their integration looks really different because it has a set of values that, with higher barriers, I should say, right? So harder tests, harder. There's no country harder to integrate into than Denmark. If you look at the requirements, it's just not just language, but like when the tests happen in your immigration journey and like the length of time. It's a very homogenous, it's not just ethnically homogenous, but it's such an expansive welfare state. It's like such a generous model that like they're very, we would use the term, we would use the term chauvinistic, like that they believe in generous welfare, right, for our people. So for you to pass the barrier, it's very high.
But that to me is the difference that makes it interesting when we look at other countries. Like, again, if we could have our country set up in the way like the Swedens and the Denmarks and really live that kind of truth where we're spending money on our education to make sure that our kids are actually educated, where we're spending money on our healthcare so that people are healthy enough to go to all these jobs that we could be doing and creating for ourselves. It's like we would be sitting in the catbird seat right now. It'd be fabulous. We could be.
Well, we'd also have I think you and I wouldn't, because we have very different immigration systems. So places like Sweden and Denmark have high levels of asylum. So they welcome refugees because they can be very choosy about where refugees come from when they have those kinds of inclusive systems. They don't have expansive immigration policies like we do with family unification. So it's
couple of comments.
It's easy to look inclusive, I think.
Yeah, well, so a couple of comments from Christian. First, as a Dane, he can confirm what you're saying, and an important comment, I think, building off of what you've been describing, Keith, as an older brother to a current UCI international student threatened by the entire ICE messaging around international students. That's another way. I'm sort of paraphrasing it, but it's the political systems are put together in a way that puts people's lives at risk. So not even domestically, so internationally, right? Absolutely. And he asks whether you foresee citizenship becoming globally tougher to achieve, or is there going to be more drive to integration going forward? So COVID, I'm adding, COVID seems to be just like destroying all of that. Again, I'm conflating migration and citizenship.
So maybe you saw that story, how the U.S. passport only gets you entry into like 26 countries internationally.
We're literally just like setting our passports on fire before the show. So it's literally
So when we talk about
burn it, Keith, burn it. Yeah, okay.
So when we talk about the value of citizenship, it really means something different today, right? But of course, the value of citizenship is not just the right to exit your country and enter a different one. It's all the rights that you get with it, and it's the obligations that you associate with it, right? And it's an identity. So it's tempting to say that like US citizenship is garbage now just because we feel really bad about how our government has responded to this crisis. However, like in the grand scheme of things, in the longer timeline, should this pandemic ever pass us, like the U.S. passport is a really powerful one to have. Yeah.
I don't like your use of the word should. So this brings me to, I just want to be sensitive to the time, to my final question for both of you. I'm going to start with Sarah, about your research on going back to COVID-19 and polarization. And I direct this to you first because you've done this research, but I really want to hear from both of you on this. So you mentioned we know what doesn't work as far as getting people to listen to scientists or go against partisan cues to change behavior. Do you have any reason for hope or speculation? I know you don't know what works yet, but what could we be doing to maybe hope here in the US we get past the partisanship around COVID? Let me put it that way.
So there is some good news in the data that we see. Like for me, what's most reassuring has nothing to do with health, by the way. What's most reassuring to me is that neither Republicans or Democrats want to delay elections. So that is very hopeful for totally different reasons.
Right. Right. I was like, oh, cool. So we're all going to die in November. Got it. Yeah.
But doesn't matter, right? But like the fact that they both want to hold elections when elections are scheduled is a very calming and reassuring sign for me that like fundamental democratic norms are still in place for both sides.
Okay.
So that was great news for me.
Speaking of, donate right here to paypal.me/askaps, and it's all going to fair fight to ensure or fight for fair elections in the fall. But sorry, I interrupted you just to plug our campaign. That's it. Okay, so there's some hope. We're fighting for democratic norms. Both sides are. Can you imagine, a few years ago when we're like, it would be good news if both parties agree there should still be an election.
Well, because the thing is, pandemics are perfect opportunities for authoritarian aspiring leaders to consolidate power, right?
Which is what is happening.
We see it here, we see it in Hungary, right? I mean, Bolsonaro, that's a really good time if you want to implement Emergency Powers Act. Crises are when you do it. So it's a great sign that both sides think that we should keep this norm in place.
I like that. Okay, Keith, what gives you optimism or hope, if anything, in all this?
That I can still laugh about other shit. That people falling down still makes me laugh. I'm sorry.
You are right about that. I haven't watched enough falling down videos lately.
I've been letting myself watch a lot of zombie movies, and oddly enough, it's given me a lot of joy because I keep thinking, if this were a zombie apocalypse versus this whole COVID thing going on, how many family members am I going to have to stab in the head with a fucking toothpick or ice pick? Because, or how many regular citizens walking around you're going to have to, ice pick once or twice because they're not going to get it.
Okay.
That scares me, but at the same time, it's a wonderful challenge.
Yes.
I was going to say Three Stooges. We're watching a lot of, prank calls here, but that works too.
That works, and again, I fall into the joy of being able to have a Broadway score make me happy. So, I just have to stay hopeful to think that that's going to be something that will come back. And that
what are you listening to?
Right now, I'm listening to The Prom. Beth Level, love. But it is one of those things where that's how I have to find the joy because, it's the only people don't understand. Half of the reason why folks are sane right now because they're watching TV and watching all these shows. It's that's because of the arts.
Yeah.
And so it's I have to believe that the arts are going to be able to be something that will survive this because we're going to need that, God forbid, for the next pandemic.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So
we should all do our civic duty and be artists. How about that?
Be artists and vote. And I went to jury duty once and I was very upset with the whole idea that I was in Westchester being asked to care about somebody's property. I'm they were having problems at the condo with the condo board.
Yeah.
So two rich lawyers fighting a condo board and they want me to help chime in on it. It's this is
amazing that they selected you.
Yeah. Well,
given you're I don't have sympathy for any of you.
And I've got nothing. So why am I going to care?
If you ever want to get kicked off of a jury panel, just tell me you have a PhD in political science. That really leads to your exclusion.
Yeah, and now you do by virtue of joining this show.
That's right.
We absolutely agree with PhDs. All right, so we are way past our time. So we got to, as always, is this show. We got to wrap this up. Keith, let's start with you. You've got your Twitter handle here. Is that the best place for folks to find you? I would imagine.
Yes, and if you really love me, you can Venmo me too. And
yes, is it Comedy Daddy on Venmo?
Yes, honey.
Hell yes, you got it. All right, very good. So that's send some Venmo via Patreon, etc. for his show. All of those good things. Keep the arts alive. I love it. And Sarah, where can folks find you?
In my house? No,
Yes.
I'm on Twitter at that Sarah Goodman.
Hooray. Spelled correctly. Very good. All right. Well, thank you both so much for joining us. Thank you all who are watching. Always love to have you here. We have just 2 shows left this summer. We're taking August off so I don't lose my mind. But you can continue your donations here to Fair Fight. And you can find out more about our next 2 shows. We have Candace Watts-Smith next week talking about how to stay woke versus racial stasis. And we have Angela X. Ocampo on the last Thursday of July to talk about Latinx politics. So that's what's coming up. And then we'll be back in time for the election and just have a big group freak out. So
which will definitely happen.
Which will definitely happen.
Yeah.
Which will happen.
So thank you all again for being here. Thank you, Sarah, Keith. Thank you all, and good night.
Voila. All right.